Lord, we love happy endings and underdog stories, but the Bible is not a Hallmark movie. Challenge us to find the deeper meaning in our scriptures today. Amen.
Our first reading this morning is taken from Ruth chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, and chapter 4, verses 13 to 17. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now here is the kinsman, Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me I will do." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nurturer of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. The second reading is from 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 to 16. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Go now to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there, for I have commanded a widow there to feed you." So he set out and went to Zarephath. When he came to the gate of the town, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and said, "Bring me a little water in a vessel so that I may drink." As she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." But she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am now gathering a couple of sticks so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of meal will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not fail until the day that the Lord sends rain on the earth." She went and did as Elijah said, so that she, as well as he and her household, ate for many days. The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. And our final reading is from Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 44. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she has, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on."
Thank you, Carol. Tomorrow is Remembrance Day, where we will gather around cenotaphs and monuments, listening to the mournful sounds of trumpets and bagpipes, and perhaps the reading of the Act of Remembrance. You might also hear the poem In Flanders Fields that we heard in the video that the children sang too. Now, if we don't remember the sacrifices made by those who went to serve us all, we are in danger of reliving it. And if there is ever a third world war, well, there won't be anyone left to memorialize that. When I hear the list of names, they are usually of husbands, sons, and fathers. And I wonder, what about the women? Well, certainly there were women who served. Many of you may know some in your own family. And our late Queen Elizabeth was also served in the war as she drove a Jeep, and she was a mechanic as well. But what about the women who stayed behind? What about the ones who had to become mother and father to their children? What about the mothers who kissed their sons goodbye, not knowing if they would ever see them again? But women's sacrifices were not just limited to the home. Women stepped up and worked in factories, and they made ammunition and uniforms and other supplies necessary for the war. And some of these jobs actually paid quite well, and some of these women actually had independence for the first time. I remember in my family album, there's a picture of my Aunt Eunice wearing her coveralls and looking very proud of herself in them. But I feel somewhat conflicted on Remembrance Day because I believe, like many, that war should not be glorified. But if it wasn't for World War II, I wouldn't be here. You see, my parents were on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. My father was British, he was in the RAF, and they were being trained in Canada. Well, my mother belonged to the YWCA, and they put on a Christmas dinner for the British boys who were away from home. And that's where my parents met. Well, their courtship was through letters, which wasn't uncommon. You know, people sometimes wonder, how can you carry on a relationship through the internet? And I think, well, wasn't that different when people wrote letters, was it? And my mother was actually writing to 3 different British airmen. So I guess my father was the only one that came back, so he kind of won the lottery that way. But also, there's a bit of sadness because, you know, the young man that left was not the same person that returned. And I don't think she knew, or he really knew, the extent of the damage that had been done to his heart and soul when he was away at war. Well, in most of the conflicts around the world, it's women that bear the brunt of it. There are 43 million refugees in the world today, and that's not even counting the ones that are internally displaced within their countries. And half of all of those are women and children. Some flee for their own safety and for that of their children's. And some leave for economic reasons because the means of their support have been destroyed. Cities that once provided jobs and farms that once provided sustenance have been devastated. So famine results, and what little soil is left is often washed away in floods. Now, the story of Ruth and Naomi in the book of Ruth is about famine, displacement, and poverty. Now, Naomi and her husband Elimelech, they had left Bethlehem in Judah originally because of famine. Ironically, Bethlehem means house of bread. They traveled to Moab, where their sons married Moabite women. Now, they might have known that this would have ended badly, because the sons of Naomi were Mahlon and Chilion, which means frail and sickly. So it's maybe not a surprise to the reader that they both died. And since Naomi was also widowed, this meant that they had no male relative to support them. And today we call this food insecurity. Well, Ruth and Naomi became refugees, and they returned to Bethlehem to seek a living there. And even though she is an outsider, Ruth supports them by gleaning in the fields. Now, according to the law of Moses, you could only gather the inside of your field. You were to leave the outside not harvested. And that's so that the poor and widows and other people could reap those, and that they could find themselves a living with that. Now, Ruth has attracted the attention of the field's owner, who was Boaz. And Naomi comes up with a scheme to get Boaz to marry Ruth. Unfortunately, the lectionary has once again left out what I call the naughty bits. Well, I'll fill it in for you. Naomi tells Ruth to uncover his feet. Now, the word for uncover is usually associated with nakedness, to uncover nakedness. And feet, well, that's a euphemism for male genitals, so you get the picture. Ruth is either exceptionally brave or exceptionally obedient, because this was a gamble to win or lose all. Boaz could have taken her and thrown her out on her rear, and then she would have had to travel back to Naomi alone in the dark, which was very dangerous, and her reputation could then have been destroyed. I can't help but wonder how many women have had to make these difficult choices in times of war. Many women are trafficked because their bodies are the only thing that they have left to sell. Now, in the story of Elijah and the woman of Zarephath, we again have a story about a widow. Again, there is a famine. And amid this scarcity, God sends Elijah to the region of Sidon, where he will meet this widow who is to feed him. Have you noticed the theme here? We have widows in every story. Now, when Elijah comes to the city, he finds this widow gathering sticks to prepare a fire for cooking. Now, you think that he would have offered at least to help, but he comes right out with it and demands a drink. And when she goes to get one for him, he then also asks for some food. Well, she might have been thinking that this stranger has got some nerve, because old Mother Hubbard has nothing in her cupboard. And she told him with resignation that she was going to go make a final meal for herself and her son. I'm wondering if there might have been a little bit of exaggeration here, because you'll notice later that it says that they were able to provide for her and for him and her household. So it wasn't just her and her son. There was a household at stake here. But Elijah told her not to be afraid. A lot of divine pronouncements began this way: be not afraid. Well, maybe she shrugged and thought, well, if we're going to die of hunger anyways, why don't we feed this crazy man? Often I find it's people who have the least who are the willing to give the most. This reminds me of a story I may have told you before, but please bear with me. When I was living in Toronto, we went to a church that was in the inner city, and a lot of homeless people then, as now. And as I was going by in a hurry to get to church, there was this couple sitting there, and they were panhandling, and they had like a blanket wrapped around them, and it was getting pretty cold out. And he was an older guy who looked like he'd been on the street a number of years. You really couldn't tell whether it had been 10 years, 30 years. They all got the same look. And the woman with him was much younger, basically maybe a teenager, hadn't been out on the streets that long. And as I went by, he said, a loonie for a meal. I stopped, I looked at him, and he said, we need one more loonie for a meal. I thought, well, okay, I've got a loonie, why not? I stopped, dug into my purse, gave him the loonie. And then he took the girl's hands and he took the little pot of money they had and he poured them all into her hands. He looked at her and he said, go. And she got up and she ran off with all the money. And he said, we only had enough money for one. And I said, well, how will you know that she'll come back? And he went, maybe she will, maybe she won't. But she needed it more than I did. Well, in the Gospel of Mark, we have another story about poverty and abundance and another poor widow. Jesus has been teaching the disciples about the difference between putting on a big show about being religious and actually following the law of God. And right on cue, a poor woman steps up as a sermon illustration. Jesus watches as she puts her last 2 coins into the temple treasury. And I didn't know this, but he would have been sitting in the court of the women to have had that perspective, been able to see that. Well, he called on his disciples to pay attention to this. Now, some people read what he says as a praise for her selfless devotion. But I think it could also have been righteous indignation. Look at this woman. She gave everything she had while those rich bastards made a show of what they give. Maybe when she put those 2 coins in, she was saying, you know what? You took everything from me. This is the last I have. Take that too. I kind of feel that way when I see some of the 1%ers make a big deal out of the charities that they support. But what they spend on eating out in a month could feed a family for a year. Real charity is done quietly. Some of you may not know, but Taylor Swift, probably one of the best known and maybe one of the richest entertainers that we have today, in her world tours, wherever she stops in a city, she makes donations to the food banks, to charities that are helping out the poor and the homeless. Never makes a big fuss about it, just does it. And read up sometime about Keanu Reeves. He's the actor from the Matrix series, probably wealthy beyond most of our dreams. He lives in New York in an apartment. He walks everywhere he goes, but he will sit down with people, whoever they are, a homeless person, a stranger, a friend, and he will pay for their meal, give them enough money to live on. And this is extended to his work. When he was working on a movie, and the producer said to him that they didn't think it was going to make much money, and so the cast might not be able to be paid. He paid the entire cast and crew out of his own funds. So look up some of the things he's done, because you wouldn't know it. Looking at him, he just looks like this humble guy, and he is. But that's what real charity is. It comes from humility. It comes from the inside. I think that Jesus probably sent some of his disciples after this woman to find out more about her circumstances, because he knew what the law required. In Deuteronomy 24, in several verses, there is special care to be taken of the widows, the orphans, the aliens, and the poor. The aliens would have been the immigrants and the refugees, sometimes referred to as the alien within your gate. So maybe we need to think about that when we are hearing about the way some politicians talk about immigrants. So his anger at the scribes is not for their beliefs. It is for their hypocrisy in not living out those beliefs, because there shouldn't be such hypocrisy among them. When we think of the wars that Canada has been involved in, we usually think of the 2 world wars and the Korean War. Some people want to add in the Vietnam War, but we weren't actually in that one. But in Canadian history, since 1867, there have been 7 wars. One was called the Nile Expedition, then the South African War, the First and Second World Wars, the Korean War, which actually never ended because there hasn't been a peace treaty to this day. And then there was the Persian Gulf War and the war in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2011. There were probably wars earlier to 1867, but that's when, before it was Canada, it would have been the British North America that we would have participated in. And there have been other military events that we took part in through the UN peacekeepers, so the blue helmets, we would have served in that as well. Now, we kind of think that peace is sort of, the rule and that wars are the exception. We tend to think that wars are fairly rare today. Well, would you think maybe that there's 5 wars going on, 10, 15? There's 27 wars currently going on in the world. Now, of course, we know a lot more about 2 of them because it's been in the news more than others. Of course, the war in Ukraine since February 24th, 2022. And the war on Gaza, October 7, 2023, which began with the invasion of Israel by Hamas. And some people say, well, where does the United Church of Canada stand? Because there's been a lot of talk about can you be for one without being against the other? Well, the International Court of Justice ruled on the situation. It's case 192, if you ever want to look it up. And it's pretty far-reaching, talking about a cessation of hostilities, the return of hostages, and that special care needs to be taken to be sure that civilians, including women and children, are not harmed. Sounds familiar. So where the United Church stands is that it supports the ruling of the International Court of Justice. Now we know that there have been 40,000 victims, approximately, in Gaza, and most of those are women and children. There are also Israeli deaths, 1,200. There are 87 hostages being held in Gaza. But by October of this year, Israel held 5,200 Palestinians, including 170 children, in its prisons. And this is all taken from the internet and been fact-checked. What this tells us is that war is not good for women and children. Jewish law and the teachings of Jesus uphold the duty to care for the most vulnerable. So tomorrow, when you're sharing stories for Remembrance Day, maybe from your own family, from people you knew, maybe when you read the names, there will be names of people or families that are familiar to you. Let's not forget the women. This Remembrance Day, let's remember the women. And now, our hymn of response is 494, Those Hearts That We Have Treasured. And I just want to tell you that the words to this were written by Reverend Sylvia Dunstan, a United Church minister, who I had the privilege of knowing. And she was asked if she could write a hymn for AIDS memorials that was not specifically Christian, that would be appropriate in a multi-faith setting. And so this is what she wrote. It can be found in Voices United at 494, Those Hearts That We Have Treasured.